Hi, and welcome to Comedy Recapped. Today we will be examining 1991's LA Story. Beware, spoilers ahead. We open up on a soothing pool as women sit around enjoying the Los Angeles sun. Suddenly, a hot dog is flown in by helicopter, and they all wave as it passes by. Across town, everyone goes out to get their papers at the same time, and they wave hello to each other. Life seems to be going just fine for most of the town's citizens. But then we meet Harris, as he tells us that he's had 7 heart attacks. He's at his morning routine of stationary bike riding, and he pushes himself as someone else gets shuttled away by ambulance. Later, we see that he has no problem handling the Los Angeles traffic, as he takes the sidewalk and random backyards of his neighbors to get by all of it. Harris really puts his car to the test as he takes alleys and stairways until he gets to his parking spot at the studio. Once he gets backstage, he tries to shoot down his assistant, Frank, as he talks about a promotion. And he rushes to his station at the weather desk. Harris gives the weather in the most wacky fashion possible, and his fellow anchors mention the degrees he's wasting with this wacky weather while on the air. Afterwards, he goes to get ready to leave for lunch, but Trudy is nowhere near ready. Harris waits in the car, and he takes a moment to think about his life. When Trudy finally comes out, he rushes to get them to their lunch without being much later, and they talk about the friends that will be there. Somehow they end up being the first ones to arrive at lunch. Finally, everyone shows up, and they do their little meet and greet before sitting down to eat. After some conversation, Sarah arrives fashionably late, and Ronald gets up to escort her to the table. She ends up making quite an impression with her mannerisms, and she starts to pull out all sorts of stuff from her purse. During their lunch, she really takes notice of Harris. And when an earthquake comes through, she's the only one that even cares to take notice of it. She seems to love the lifestyle of the area. But when she spots some newlyweds, she seems to get depressed. And Harris notices. Trudy also notices the attention they seem to be giving each other. When they leave the lunch, Trudy really starts to break down Sarah's personality, and Sarah has to push Roland off of her. Just as Sarah gets ready to leave, she spots Trudy and Harris takes a moment to appreciate her awkward sense of conversation. He hops in his car and starts to take Trudy home, but he forgot to let her in the car and goes back to pick her up. Later, Harris goes shopping for some new pants, and he gets a little distracted by the beautiful women around him. Suddenly, Sandy comes over to hem his pants, and he can't help being distracted by her personal sense of customer service. After that, Trudy and Harris head home at night, but his car breaks down on the freeway. While he is pulled over to check on the car, he winds up noticing a talking street sign that starts trying to converse with him. He can't help but think that this is all a prank, but he listens to the signpost when it tells him to hug it. The sign tries to tell him that the city wants to help him, and it gives him a riddle to solve. When he gets back in the car, he tells Trudy about the talking sign, and she blows it off as him simply blabbering. Harris drops himself off at home, and Trudy leaves in a hurry. The next morning, Sarah and Harris wake up in their own beds at precisely the same time, and Sarah enjoys watching Harris's weather report. She decides to call Harris to see if he would be okay with her doing an interview for her London paper. Naturally, he has no issue with it, and after he hangs up, he takes a drive to 2 houses away to visit Ariel. Ariel and Harris head to the museum, where they shoot a wacky film of him roller skating around the museum's show floor. The next day, Harris and Sarah arrive at his house for the interview, and he decides to take her on a tour of LA. His tour is an absolute hit with Sarah, and when they get to the cemetery, they run into a funny gravedigger. The gravedigger actually digs up a famous magician that Harris knew personally, and he seems to feel something going on after she quotes him. He decides to take a chance, and he asks if she's seeing anyone. She tells him that she is, and he remembers that he is too. After that, the interview comes to a close. Later, Harris heads to work to pre-record the weekend weather, but when the weekend comes, it ends up being completely the opposite of what he predicted. Harris makes his way through the rain to check on his pants, and he gets there just as they close. Sandy remembers him, but Harris is too preoccupied with her flirtatious nature. He leaves her his number, and he decides to hop on the freeway. When he passes the sign that talks to him, it tells him that he should have gotten her number while he was at it, but he blows it off and heads home. He tries to figure out why he is imagining a talking sign, but he gets a call from Sandy. The two of them meet up at the Hard Rock Cafe, and it turns out that the date was actually her boyfriend's idea. After getting over that moral hurdle, he heads out with Sandy. But he doesn't see Trudy getting there with one of their mutual friends. Across town, Sarah talks with Roland, and he tries to see if she would let them get back together even though they're divorced. He begs for one weekend to convince her they belong together, but she seems to think that they're better off keeping apart. Meanwhile, Harris walks Sandy home, and she gives him the kiss of his life before saying goodbye. The next day, Harris gets a call from Trudy, and she tells him that she needs to come over to talk to him. When she gets there, he guesses that she slept with Frank, and she admits that it's been going on for 3 years. That night, Harris goes to the signpost to celebrate his freedom, and he tells it that all he needs now is to do something other than the weather. The sign assures him that the weather will end up changing his life twice. When he goes to work later, his editor fires him for his false prediction, and Harris waits for the second change to come. Later, Harris goes to get an enema with Sandy, and she asks if they'll see each other again. He tells her he'd love to, but when it comes time to make a reservation, he goes through a financial interrogation that ends with him empty-handed. He calls Sandy to see if a weekend away in Santa Barbara would be okay. And of course, she's ecstatic about it. When he gets back in town, Harris goes to skate around another museum, but he ends up crashing into Sarah, who is there with Roland. Sarah invites him and Ariel to walk around with them. And of course, Harris tries to show off his artistic prowess, which is non-existent. After the museum, Harris goes with Sarah and Roland to eat at the restaurant he couldn't get a reservation at. And afterwards, Sarah gives Harris a ride home. She tells him that Roland is just a friend, and when they get to his house, the wind blows just enough to make the car start rolling. They try to stop it, but the city seems to take control of the car. Harris thinks he knows what this is, and he has them go for a ride when the car opens its doors. The car takes them to the signpost, and it tells him to kiss her. After that, they head back to Harris's house, and he asks her to come with him to a fundraising dinner that is coming up. She agrees, and she heads home to call her mom and play the tuba. The next evening, Harris shows up at Sarah's to pick her up, and she seems on edge about their kiss last night. They decide to simply forget about their last evening. When they get to the dinner, Harris starts feeling woozy, and they step out into the yard to make love. When they come back to the dinner, they tell the other guests that they are feeling much better. The next day, Harris goes to see Sandy to tell her that he started seeing someone, and she seems really bummed out. It's after she asks about how he feels about Sarah spending the weekend with her ex that he decides to still take Sandy to Santa Barbara. Well, it turns out that they're actually staying at the same place Roland and Sarah are. Not only that, but they're actually staying in the room next to them. Once they get settled in their rooms, Harris and Sandy get it on, and Roland and Sarah listen in from their room. They end up doing the exact same thing, too, and Harris and Sandy listen in on them. It's later on in the day that all four of them run into each other in the hallway. Sarah seems very upset, and Harris isn't sure what to make of what he just heard. Roland invites them to dinner, and they end up spending the rest of the night together on the beach. For a moment, Roland heads up to the hotel to grab a sweater, and Harris and Sarah argue about who's lying to whom and why they're in this situation. Harris tries to convince her to stay in LA with him, and he tells her that if she gets on the plane to go back to England, he'd turn the winds around if he could. Eventually, Roland gets back, and they continue their awkward walk. The next day, Roland walks around sullenly, and he tells Harris that Sarah decided to go back to London. The two men sit on the steps to cry, and when they go back to LA, Harris goes to Sarah's house to try and convince her to stay. It doesn't work, and Sarah goes to the airport as Harris goes to his new job as a boring news anchor. That night, Sarah gets on the plane, and the weather takes a nasty turn. A storm rages that causes the plane to stay grounded, and the signpost seems to go crazy. When Harris makes his way outside, he sees a taxi pull up with Sarah, and he knows that this is the second time the signpost talked about. She walks over to him and kisses him in the middle of the storm. Afterwards, they go to the signpost to thank it for helping them. But when Harris asks how all of this really happened, the signpost tells him that there are bigger things out there working to keep things going. As bagpipes play from the signpost, Harris and Sarah kiss. Steve Martin is a trip no matter what movie he's in, and LA Story is the perfect example as to why. Not only does he star in the film, but the movie was actually straight from his mind, as he was the writer. And that wraps up this recap. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this recap, Please subscribe with notifications turned on so you don't miss a single video.